Shavua Tov. As many of you know already, this last Shabbat's sermon of mine was delayed because of rain. And so as promised, I'm recording the sermon for you now so that you can listen to it at your leisure during this week. And we can still keep up with our schedule of the 3 sermons of the spiritual middot or spiritual attributes that I have been sharing with you over this time period. Last week, we spoke about the midah of bitachon, the midah of trust. And next week, we're going to speak about the midah or spiritual attribute of zrizut, which is enthusiasm. But today, I'd like for us to spend a little bit of time thinking about the soul trait, the midah of savlanut, of patience. And there really is no better place to start this conversation than the Torah portion that we read last week. Parashat Bo brought us to the last of the plagues. But let's think about the plagues for a moment. At each plague, the children of Israel had the hope that they were finally going to be set free after hundreds of years of slavery. And after each plague, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he said no. Plague after plague, this same pattern played itself out. The children of Israel learned what savlanut, what patience means, and sometimes how difficult it can be. Because we human beings, we want everything right now. We want to be able to see the results of our actions without having to wait for it. Everything needs to be immediate. But savlanut is actually necessary, and delays are part of our life and are part of this world. So I'd like for us to spend some time thinking about the Jewish perspective on patience, on savlanut, and see what we can learn for this period in our lives, this period in our history, and for our ability to step forward in our lives. So what is our Jewish understanding of savlanut? Musar teacher Rabbi Shlomo Wolbe writes as follows: the patient person is exactly like someone who is carrying a heavy package. Even though it weighs on him, he continues to go on his way, and he doesn't take a break from carrying it. So for Rabbi Wolbe, patience is a burden. Patience is a challenge. It's something that we have to carry with us, and it takes effort. And if we think about it, the Hebrew word savlanut has connections both to the word suffer, lisbol, and to carry or to bear something, or a porter. It's the same Hebrew word. And I think that's where Rabbi Wolbe is getting his idea here, that patience is something that needs to be born, it needs to be carried, and it's not easy. The Cheshbon Nefesh writes as follows: for those serious incidents which come upon us unavoidable and which we are powerless to prepare for, or which we could not deal with once they transpired, God has provided us with a remedial regimen: patience. So the Cheshbon Nefesh writes that patience is a cure. Patience is something that is not a burden. Patience can lift us up. Patience, as he writes, is a cure for helplessness. Perhaps helplessness itself is the burden, but patience is the cure. Think about it. When there are times that we find ourselves the most impatient, more often than not, it's when we don't feel like we're able to do something, when we feel helpless. And it's those moments when we feel helpless, when we feel like we can do nothing at all, when we have no control, that we find that patience can actually help get us through that difficult time on to the next moment so that we have a chance to move forward. So we have patience as a weight that we carry, but we also have patience as a medicine, as a remedy when we're stuck and feeling like there's nothing that we can do. A third source and way to think about this actually doesn't come at it from patience, but comes at it from the impatience side of it. And Alan Marinis, one of the Musar teachers of the current century, writes as follows: impatience seldom makes things happen faster or better, and usually only causes us grief. It is an inner blaze that burns us up without giving off any warmth. I love that image. It's a blaze that consumes us, but it doesn't actually do what we want most from fire. We want warmth. We want the ability to use it to cook, to make our lives better. But instead, impatience is that fire that consumes with no benefit. And finally, one last source for us to think about comes from the Talmud. It's one of my favorite sources on impatience, or on patience. And it comes from Masechet Eruvin, the tractate on Eruvin. And it reads as follows: Rabbi Preda had a certain student whom he would have to teach 400 times, and only then would he learn. One day, the other rabbis requested Rabbi Preda's presence to come and help them with a mitzvah matter. And Rabbi Preda taught his students the 400 times as usual, but this time, his student did not successfully learn the material. So Rabbi Preda said to him, "What's the difference now that you're unable to grasp this lesson?" So his student said to him, "From the time that they came and said to you, 'Master, there's a mitzvah matter for which you're needed,' my mind was distracted from the lesson. And every moment I said, 'Now my teacher's going to get up and go. Now my teacher's going to get up and go.' And I couldn't pay attention." So Rabbi Preda said to him, "Pay attention, and I will teach you. And know that I will not leave you until you have fully mastered the lesson." And he taught him again an additional 400 times. Just then, I mean, the source could end right now, but there's a little tagline on at the end, a little addition on at the end. Just then, a divine voice emerged and said to Rav Preda, "Is it preferable to you that 400 years be added to your life, or that you and the rest of your generation will merit the world to come?" And Rav Preda said, "I prefer that I and my generation will merit the world to come." The Holy One, blessed be God, then said to the angels, "Give him both." Now, I like this because it's such a wonderful Talmudic source, but it also shows the power of patience, right? The two greatest rewards that we as human beings can get are a longer life, potentially, long, good life, one would hope, and the world to come. And because of Rav Preda's patience in teaching, now, 400 times, I think the text is using that as hyperbole here to say that he taught him as many times as was necessary until he mastered the lesson, whatever it took. And that patience that Rabbi Preda showed not only gave him a longer life, personal, but merited that he and his entire generation would have a place in the world to come. That is how valuable, that is how potent patience can be in our lives. Now, let's be honest, there are times when patience is not always a virtue. Like when I spoke about trust last week, there's a spectrum. Too little patience is anger and frustration. Too much patience is inaction and fatalism. And that's clearly not within our tradition either, especially when facing injustice or suffering. Those are things that we need to move on. We can't just sit back and say, well, I need to exercise patience. But other than that, other than understanding that we have to find that sweet spot of not too much inaction and not too little patience. Patience is seen in our tradition as something that is highly valuable, not only for other people, but for our own ability to be happy and to grow. Kira Newman, who is the managing editor of the Greater Good magazine, argues that there are actually 4 different scientific reasons to cultivate patience. She said, first, patient people enjoy better mental health. They're able to cope with the world better, and that patience allows them to deal with challenging situations differently than impatient people. Second, she argues, patient people are better friends and neighbors. That makes sense to me. I would much rather have my friends be patient with my failures and my challenges and the things and my mistakes than people who are constantly pushing me or constantly impatient and waiting for me for the next step. Third, patience helps us achieve our goals. When we can take a step back, when we can think about it, when we can plan, we're actually much more able to achieve our goals. And finally, she argues that scientifically it's proven that patient people tend to have better health. Patience is linked to good health, just good overall physical health, not just mental health. So how do we cultivate it? How do we bring patience into our life? And how do we practice this very difficult midah? Rabbi Yechiel Yitzchak Per says, you can train yourself to be patient. He writes, you can train yourself to open the space between the match and the fuse. And I love this image because it recognizes that the match and the fuse are there. We're not blind to the fact that those flames, those fires within us burn sometimes. And we're not blind to the fact that we have a fuse that when lit and when it goes off, we go through the roof. But if we can find a way to create space between the match and between the fuse, we're able to use that to cultivate patience. That in and of itself is patience. Now, this requires the ability to recognize our own match and our own fuse, our own impatience, and to take responsibility for it. Alan Marinis calls this witnessing and naming. We have to be honest with ourselves. We have to hear and feel those moments when we start to see the match and the fuse coming closer and actively, consciously, intentionally work to separate them. Greg Marcus argues in his book, Spiritual Practice of Good Actions, which I highly recommend. He argues that each midah has a mantra that he's created for himself that helps him think about how to practice and live that particular midah, that particular spiritual attribute. For savlanut, for patience, his mantra is, this too shall pass, and I have the strength to get by until it's done. Two sides. One, that every moment passes, even the challenging ones and even the good ones. But the moments when we find ourselves stuck, it actually doesn't last forever. And at some point in time, we are going to get unstuck. We are going to be able to move past that. But we have to recognize that we have the strength to be in that stuck moment until we do. So he offers a number of different other suggestions. I'm going to bring 4 of them that I really appreciated as I read through his book. First, remind yourself that it's okay to be patient. You know, in this modern, everyone needs to go out and go get them type of world, sometimes impatience is rewarded, is praised. that we don't want to sit back and be thought of as being passive or thought of as being not somebody who's going to go out and do the most and do the best. And because of that, we get impatient. It's okay to take a step back. It's okay to be patient. It's okay to think and plan and take a breath. The second suggestion is give thanks for the opportunity to practice patience. Sometimes we see these moments when we're waiting in a line and it seems to go on interminably, or we're behind someone who's doing something that's stopping us from being able to do the things that we want to do. He says that he tries to say to himself, thank you, God, for this test of my spiritual elevation. Giving thanks just for the opportunity to say, okay, now I'm going to practice the midah of patience. But it brings an awareness. It brings a focus. He then argues that we need to take the time to look for the divine spark in others. When we remember that not only we are important in this world, but that each and every person has a divine spark, each and every person is created in the image of God, when we recognize that, when we realize that, then perhaps we can find the ability to be a little bit more patient. And finally, my favorite, he says, summon a song from your playlist. And he reminds us that Rav Nachman of Bratslav said, and we quote, get into the habit of always singing a tune. It will give you a new life and send joy into your soul. Sometimes, in order to give ourselves that space to be patient, we have to fill our mind with something that takes us away from the anger, from the frustration that allows that match and that fuse to separate from one another. Sing a song, say a poem, remember a quote that inspires you, that lifts you up. These are ways to help break that cycle and help us practice the midah of savlanut, the midah of patience. My friends, may this new week help us to find opportunities to practice the midah of savlanut. May we find ways to separate the match from the fuse, to slow down our boil, and find the divine spark in the others around us. Shavua Tov.